Hi, I'm Sara Parent-Ramos. I teach ceramics at Montgomery College. I'm an associate professor of art and ceramics coordinator. I also teach art appreciation. I teach all levels of ceramics here at the Rockville campus on Montgomery College. I'm a practicing artist. My work uses a variety of media, but I'm mainly sculptural, and I really love the medium of clay, so that's kind of what I gravitate towards. Um, I had a really circuitous route getting to being an artist. I worked for a while in research psychology in the US, in Italy, spent some time teaching in Morocco. And my first art class was actually here on the Rockville campus of Montgomery College. So some credit there to kind of making me think that it was even possible to be an artist. My work currently focuses on the kind of making tangible the intangible things. So looking at like the microbiome, like all those little bugs and things in our gut, or thinking about larger social issues and networks. And I try to give those form through my sculpture. So that's a little bit about me. For my Smithsonian Fellowship, which was, I have to say, an amazing experience, I really focused in on a ceramic, intro to ceramic, ceramic one class that I teach at Montgomery College. The unique twist with this class was in part due to the pandemic and also just because we were interested in running a pilot. This class that I was teaching, it was a hybrid ceramics class. So it was part on Zoom and part in person. And so it was a new experience. The ceramic one class that I teach at Montgomery College, not only do students kind of become familiar with the technical skills, of course, right? But they also, one of my goals is that they also are able to see both historical and contemporary practices involving the medium of clay. But more importantly, they're able to kind of understand those artists and the objects they make in larger kind of social contexts, thinking about kind of larger social issues that are going on. They're better able to understand themselves, and they're able to draw those connections. So viewing ceramics as kind of a gateway to some of the other academic subjects that they'll encounter at Montgomery College. So that's kind of the larger context. The Ceramics 1 class is open to everyone. So it's a general education requirement. So it's not specifically art majors or a certain focus. And that makes it absolutely wonderful to teach because I have biology students, I have art majors. We are the most diverse college in the continental U.S., so we have, all these wonderful discussions cross-culturally and kind of cross-interests. So within that, I was making this hybrid course, which was like, so there was a lot of just planning and things. And so for my Smithsonian Fellowship, I decided that I really wanted to focus on using the resources of the larger kind of Smithsonian institutions, finding examples from across different museums, and thinking about traditionally marginalized voices and how those voices, both within America and around the world, could be thought about, lifted up through discussing these objects. So thinking both historically, but then also thinking about contemporary practice. And again, ceramics is this amazing medium because of its history and because of its use today and because of its connections to indigenous cultures, that you can really have some of those good questions. So what did the students actually do, right? This is all the background stuff. Well, the first part of this project, and I called this project The Stories We Tell, right? Because I was thinking of the narratives that individuals create, larger social groups create, the stories we tell ourselves, the stories we share with others. And it was a figurative project, meaning that we were focusing on figurative sculpture, figurative ceramics, right? There are many different areas of ceramics. Some of you might know pottery, right? But figurative ceramics is one of them. So first, students, because this project focused on figurative, we focused on the human hand, right? Because as a symbolic thing, hands can be connection. They're a great way to just try out doing a figurative part of the body, right? If you can do the hand in ceramics, you can, technically you can do a lot of other things. But then it's also a great metaphorical thing, right? Because we interact with our world so much with our hands. So the first thing that students did for this project was that they just documented their hands, their friends' hands, their loved ones' hands in their daily life. Like, what are they doing? What are they interacting with in the world? And this was also kind of a getting to know you assignment for the students, because then we brought those images in and they shared them. And again, when I say brought them in, we weren't meeting in person, but they shared them over a social media platform. We used Teams for this project, which is just basically like a education social media platform. So they were able to like comment on each other's hands pictures, and there were some prompts and questions and stuff. And I just wanted them to actually look, right? So much of art is about just kind of learning to see and really pay attention. So we did that first. And for the next part, students then explored, I had created a learning lab, which is one of these really cool things developed by the Smithsonian institutions, where you can grab images and photos and audio from all the different museums. For this one that I curated, it's this curated space, I drew images and all these things from the Museum of African American History and Culture, from the American Museum, there's not a museum for Latino history, but there's a very strong collection. So from all these different places, I could draw these objects and videos and all these things. And students looked through this learning lab online. And then I had some prompts getting them to think about which ones they connected with, and again, sharing with their classmates, because so much of learning is about making those connections with other people. So that was the second part, and that was really the part that kind of drew on the Smithsonian resources. And I had some students even say they went to try to, they found some of these objects, they saw where it was and they went, or, they really enjoyed the video component, because there's some great videos available through the Smithsonian institutions. And then after that, I mentioned I worked with Professor Kaya, and she had her students write papers on contemporary social movements within a intro sociology class. And so she asked her students if they would be willing to share a selection of those papers with my students. And then my students read those papers, and then we talked about some of the themes of those papers. And I asked my students to pick one of the papers and think about how the themes related to their lives, whether it was a discussion, so many discussions going on, right, with contemporary movements, but whether it was Black Lives Matter, whatever the movement that was chosen, how it related to their lives, and then to create a sculpture from that, focusing on the human hand, thinking about other objects that could be integrated to make meaning, right? Thinking about both in relation to their lives, but also larger social movements, right? And that culminated in a sculpture. Unfortunately, this sculpture was also able to be shared again with Professor Kaya's class, and so there was this back and forth. And it was just a really amazing experience. In terms of the Smithsonian resources that I integrated into my project, I really focused on a couple museums, but the cool thing about this learning lab platform that was online that you could curate is that you could draw from many different museums. You weren't kind of tied to one specific museum. And this was great for ceramics because examples of really powerful historical and contemporary pieces in ceramics are throughout the Smithsonian's institutions. And I'm going to read right here because I want to make sure I get the names of the museums right that I drew from. But the Smithsonian American Art Museum, the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian, the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, also the Smithsonian Latino Center. So those were the museums that I found had either, again, objects or videos or a material that would be useful to my students in thinking about creating these sculptures. There were some really profound specific examples. One that I think was the most salient to me was a student who chose a piece by Maria Aquelar called Bienvenida y Vayan con Dios, or Welcome and Go with God. And this piece was commissioned by the General Service Administration for the border station in San Luis, Arizona. And in the description of the piece that's in the Smithsonian Museum, it mentions that the artist created the sculpture to pay tribute to the resilient spirit of the Mexican people who overcome adversity and hope and work and live. I had a student that really related to the piece based on her personal experience, but it also raised many questions about patronage because this sculpture was commissioned for a border station, so thinking about kind of tying it into larger issues of immigration and then, of course, personal experience and the role of the artist, right? So we had some really good discussions about all of those things, which is exactly what I was hoping for with this project, right? Not just to have ceramic objects be these things, that you can look at like in terms of shape and color and line, which is all important in the arts, but also things that you can connect with on a kind of idea level, on a conceptual level. This Smithsonian Fellowship experience, it was really quite amazing to witness the impact that it had on the students. Primarily for my project, it was the creation of this learning lab, but then just making them aware that there are these resources out there, that even if they're not able to get to them physically, there's all these resources, but that they could actually, having the privilege of being in this area, you can get to those resources, to the museums. And in terms of what I saw from students, was just this kind of ability to make larger connections between the hands-on practical nature of working with a material and then the power that these objects can possess, and seeing objects that other people have made, whether we're talking, in the way past or right now. And that was a really valuable way to kind of think about ceramics. In terms of how students at the end, I had a bunch of questions to see, how did students like this experience, and particularly the Learning Lab and the Smithsonian component? Was it useful to them? And I have a couple quotes here, so I'm going to read from this paper, but the experience had me process personal experiences and emotions into a work that communicates something to others. I was able to transform thought and feelings into a 3D object. Another student mentioned, I learned that everything in the world is important and must be considered because there's an interesting story behind every object. And in terms of, the ratings, all the students basically said this was valuable, this was interesting. I even had a student comment that it was inspiration for a paper that they wrote for another class, which is awesome to hear, right? That students are making those connections and that they got an A on that paper. So that was also nice to hear. So it definitely not only for me was a wonderful experience in terms of working with another professor and working with the support that the Smithsonian Fellowship kind of just had baked into it, but then to see that translated into better outcomes for my students was incredibly rewarding. For the students, I think not only did the Smithsonian Fellowship project just kind of bolster the skills that I was hoping, the technical skills, the conceptual skills, the integrative learning that I was really hoping this project would foster. There was a couple of kind of unexpected outcomes. One of them was just the recognition, and I got this through their written material and also their discussion about their final pieces. Our final critique is what we call it. The recognition of both their shared experiences with people from different cultures, different time periods, through the objects, and also a connection with people who are making work today, and again, both in America and other places in the world. And it was really interesting to see that through kind of just looking at objects, researching them, watching videos, having this curated space where they could kind of start that discussion. They just had more kind of a visual repertoire to draw on when they were thinking about their own work. And so many of my students are thinking about those bigger questions of situating themselves in the world and what their lives are going to look like, whatever background or age they come to Montgomery College. So that's a kind of a very useful just place to be in terms of their academic kind of journey. So museum learning really enriched my students in that they were aware of the museums that are here in this area, right, in the DMV area, that have so many resources, but also the resources online as well. Just also empowering them to look for that information, to possibly go. The Smithsonian institutions are free, and that's just amazing, right? So that was one component, right? Some students knew of the Smithsonian institutions, some students didn't. The other aspect that I would say is that even though I was kind of curating a space through this learning lab, this online platform, so I was curating almost a show for my students to then dive into and to look at all these resources. I was drawing from curated material, right, and to know the high quality standards, and to listen to experts in their field talk about these things, either audio or video, to see images, to have all of that kind of reinforcing information was really wonderful. So it was kind of like, two layers of curation, but the students still had the flexibility to kind of choose the things that resonated with them. The focus of this year's fellowship was 21st century challenges. And that meant a lot of different things to the different faculty participants. For me, it meant thinking about really representation and artistic voices that may have been overlooked, or communities with artistic expression that may have been overlooked in the past, and using the Smithsonian Institution resources to expose my students to those voices, and to think about how those relate to contemporary social movements. So just being able to thinking of like what 20th century, what does that mean, challenges, to be able to have my students engage in those narratives, to start to create the scaffolding to understand themselves and their kind of context, I think was really really valuable and interesting to watch. The thought and the kind of grappling with those issues that took place. And also just awareness that there are all those amazing resources out there. I can't say that enough. So I think over the last couple years, because of the pandemic, there's been this growing kind of grappling and awareness of what distance or remote, education can look like. And there's been all kinds of exploration, and it's kind of really been pushed. Um, um, for me, just embracing the modality, right? So thinking about, okay, what are the goals of what are the learning objectives of this class, but not trying to fit it into this box that might have been previous, might have been better suited for an in-person class, but really thinking what can remote education do well, like what are the strengths, and there are some really amazing strengths. And the Learning Lab through the Smithsonian, I think, was kind of one of those unexpected, like, oh, this really works, this is great, right? Integrating this in and then opening this world of free, available, rigorous resources to students. This works, integrating it into my class. It did mean that I had to totally kind of redo the whole structure of the class to make sure I was getting the student interaction I wanted. It couldn't look the same as if it did in an in-person class, right? Or making sure the students interacted with each other, right? I had to kind of reformulate that. But there were many, many benefits, I think, to this modality. Not only did I use a Learning Lab, but there was integrating a lot of other, like a social media kind of ish platform. As I said, mentioned Teams. I've used others since then, but really thinking, what does this technology do well? How does it match with what I want students to get from this class? How accessible is the technology? And those are things that have really improved also my teaching in person to person, right? Classes as well. And draws on some of the creativity that I think when you're in the arts, you practice every day, but it's really fun to kind of have that represented in your teaching as well. I've had a little bit of time now to digest the semester. Right after a semester ends, I'm sure students feel this way. You're just like, oh, it ended, and then after a little time, you have some time to digest. And so, thinking back and kind of evaluating how I've grown through this process, there's a number of ways. First is just a greater awareness of what resources are out there. Even though I'm an original, I grew up in the DMV area. I went away for a long period and then came back recently about 4 years ago. I didn't know the extent of the Smithsonian resources. So that was just great education for me, right? And, teachers are always learning. You learn through teaching, right? Because you're presenting this material and techniques and ideas to your students, and it's a great way to also enrich and grow as an educator. So that was one, just like the sheer nature of the resources. The other thing that I think really just stood out to me was in creating this Smithsonian project and it being remote or not in person, right? Primarily via Zoom in this case. Really thinking about universal design. So the idea, I try to think about this in all my classes, but I think it just really stood out for this project because, thinking about, again, what my students need to take away from this class, all the different ways people can learn, visual, we all have different strengths and weaknesses. And so this project really pushed me to approach the same content material in a slightly different way, and just the value of really making sure that how you construct a class and the resources you use can bring in as many students as possible. This experience, the Smithsonian Fellowship, has been a real growth experience in many ways. But in particular, it's inspired me because of the collaborative nature of the experience, whether it was working with the kind of core group of fellows or the further work that I did with Professor Kaya. It reiterated how essential interdisciplinary dialogue is for creating robust learning environments, not only between students, but between faculty. And I was excited to be at an institution that allowed that to happen, that gave the mental space and time for those kind of discussions to really grow. So that's definitely a key way where this experience was inspirational. James Smithson, I don't think he could even conceptualize the unique and interesting ways that the Smithsonian institutions have grown, the voices that they're continuously starting to listen to and to bring into the discussion. There's been huge growth. And I also don't think he could even probably conceptualize the amazing things that my fellows with this Smithsonian project have created. And in some ways, that's also really inspiring because, we can't always predict or see into the future, but the idea that giving space, planting a seed, the kernel that can go and grow into these things we couldn't even imagine is, and bring in voices that weren't heard previously. That makes me happy.
This video was produced by Montgomery College Television on behalf of MC's Paul Peck Humanities Institute and Smithsonian's Office of Educational Technology. It is a companion to the Smithsonian's X-Course, Teaching with the Smithsonian, addressing 21st century challenges in the community college classroom. Learn more about this course at edx.org. Faculty interviewed for these videos teach at Montgomery College, a community college in suburban Maryland, just a subway ride from the Smithsonian Museums on the National Mall. Our MC Smithsonian Faculty Fellowship has spurred more than 25,000 visits by students and their families since 1998. Find our other faculty video interviews at youtube.com/Montgomery College.